$5 trillion. That's what NVIDIA is worth today. It's the most valuable company the world has ever seen. Every major AI company depends on its chips. From ChatGPT to self-driving cars, NVIDIA powers the technology shaping our future. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. In 1996, this same company was on the edge of collapse. Cash was running out. Products were failing. Employees had no idea if they would still have jobs a few weeks later. One wrong decision, and NVIDIA would have disappeared forever. No trillion-dollar empire, no AI revolution, no Jensen Huang success story. So how did a struggling startup become the company that changed the world? The answer begins 3 years earlier, inside an ordinary Denny's restaurant in Silicon Valley. 3 engineers sat around a table with nothing but an idea. Jensen Huang, Chris Malachowski, and Curtis Priam believed computers would one day need powerful graphics processors. At the time, almost everyone thought they were wrong. Personal computers were slow, the gaming industry was tiny, and very few investors believed graphics chips had a future. But these 3 founders saw something no one else could see. They believed visual computing would become one of the most important technologies of the future. So in April 1993, NVIDIA was born. It wasn't a giant corporation. It wasn't backed by unlimited money. It was just a small startup with a handful of engineers trying to build something the world didn't think it needed. They had a vision, but turning that vision into reality would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. At first, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. The founders rented a tiny office, hired a small team of talented engineers, and immediately got to work. Their goal wasn't just to build another computer chip. They wanted to create something that could completely change how computers displayed graphics. It was an ambitious dream, especially for a company with almost no money and no reputation. Every dollar mattered, and every mistake could be fatal. To survive, NVIDIA needed investors. Convincing them wasn't easy. In the early 1990s, most venture capitalists believed graphics chips were a niche market with very little potential. Why would anyone need expensive graphics hardware when most people only used computers for spreadsheets, documents, and simple software? Even video games looked primitive by today's standards. Many investors smiled politely, listened to the pitch, and then said no. But Jensen Huang refused to give up. He believed the world was underestimating visual computing. Eventually, NVIDIA secured enough funding to continue building its first products. It wasn't a huge investment, but it gave the company a chance to prove itself. Now came the hard part, actually designing a chip that worked. The engineers worked day and night. Long hours became normal. Sleeping in the office wasn't unusual. Everyone knew they were racing against time because larger competitors had far more money, more engineers, and years of experience. NVIDIA couldn't afford to be average. It had to build something revolutionary. In 1995, the company finally introduced its first graphics processor, the NV1. On paper, it looked innovative. Instead of following industry standards, NVIDIA tried a completely different approach to 3D graphics. Jensen believed this bold design would put the company years ahead of everyone else. Unfortunately, the market disagreed. Game developers didn't want to redesign their games around NVIDIA's unique technology. Hardware manufacturers weren't interested either. Even worse, Microsoft and the rest of the PC industry were moving toward a different graphics standard. Almost overnight, NVIDIA's biggest product became outdated before it ever had a chance to succeed. Sales were terrible. The company had spent millions developing a product that very few people wanted to buy. Warehouses filled with unsold inventory. Revenue almost disappeared, while expenses continued to rise every single month. Inside the office, the mood changed completely. Engineers who had once been excited about changing the future suddenly began worrying about whether the company would survive the year. Every paycheck depended on finding a solution before the money ran out. By early 1996, NVIDIA had burned through most of its cash. According to Jensen Huang himself, the company had only enough money left to survive for a short time. Bankruptcy was no longer just a possibility, it was becoming a reality. One evening, the leadership team gathered to face the hardest decision of their lives. They had 2 choices: keep fighting for a product that had already failed, or throw away years of work, start from scratch, and bet everything on one final chip. It was the biggest gamble in NVIDIA's history, and if that gamble failed, NVIDIA would disappear forever. Jensen Huang knew there was no time left for half measures. If NVIDIA continued down the same path, the company would run out of money and disappear. So instead of trying to fix the NV1, the team made a painful decision. They abandoned years of work and started over. It was a massive risk. For a small startup with limited cash, throwing away its biggest product sounded almost insane. But Jensen believed that admitting a mistake was better than defending a failed idea. The engineers immediately shifted their attention to a completely new graphics chip. This time, they would build around Microsoft's Direct 3D standard instead of fighting against it. It wasn't about proving they were smarter than the rest of the industry anymore. It was about building the product customers actually wanted. The pressure inside NVIDIA became unbearable. Engineers worked late into the night, often sleeping in the office. Every delay meant less money in the bank. Every design decision could determine whether the company survived or died. There was no backup plan. Months later, NVIDIA introduced a new graphics card called the Riva 128. Unlike the NV1, this chip was fast, affordable, and compatible with the software developers were already using. Reviewers praised its performance. PC manufacturers began paying attention. Gamers finally had a graphics card that delivered both speed and value. For the first time, NVIDIA wasn't chasing the market. It was starting to shape it. Orders began to grow. Revenue slowly returned. The fear inside the office was replaced with cautious optimism. Employees who had been preparing for the company's collapse were suddenly working overtime to keep up with demand. NVIDIA had survived, not because its first idea was perfect, but because its founders were willing to admit they were wrong, adapt quickly, and rebuild before it was too late. That moment became one of the most important lessons in the company's history. Success doesn't always belong to the company with the best first product. Sometimes it belongs to the company that learns the fastest. But NVIDIA's biggest breakthrough still hadn't happened. Over the next decade, the company would make another decision that almost nobody understood at the time. A decision that would eventually turn a gaming hardware company into the foundation of the artificial intelligence revolution. And once again, almost everyone thought Jensen Huang was making a mistake.